July 24, 1943. The Pacific Ocean, west of Truk Atoll. The sun was beating down on the periscope shears of the USS Tenosa. Inside the conning tower, the air was hot, stagnant, and smelled of diesel oil and unwashed bodies. Lieutenant Commander Dan Daspit was glued to the periscope handles. His knuckles were white. He was looking at the target of a lifetime. Floating dead in the water ahead of him was the Tonin Maru No. 3. It was a massive prize, a 19,000-ton Japanese oil tanker. It was the largest whaler conversion in the Japanese merchant fleet. It was a floating gas station for the Imperial Navy. Daspit had already crippled it. Earlier that morning he had fired 4 torpedoes. 2 had hit the stern, disabling the tanker's propellers. The giant ship was helpless. It wasn't going anywhere. It was a sitting duck. Daspit decided to be methodical. He wanted to verify exactly how effective his weapons were. He maneuvered the Tenosa into the perfect firing position. He brought the submarine to 875 yards, point-blank range in naval warfare. He positioned himself at a perfect 90-degree angle to the tanker's hull. He couldn't miss. It was a mathematical impossibility to miss. Tube 3, fire, Daspit ordered. The submarine shuddered as the Mark 14 steam torpedo was ejected by compressed air. The crew counted the seconds. What? A dull, metallic thud echoed through the hull of the Tenosa. Daspit watched through the periscope. He saw the splash where the torpedo hit the tanker. But there was no explosion. No fire. Just a splash. Dud, Daspit muttered. He lined up again. Tube 4, fire. What? Another thud. Another dud. Daspit felt a cold rage building in his chest. He checked his settings. Depth, 10 feet. Gyro angle, 0. Everything was perfect. Fire 5. What? Fire 6. What? For the next hour, the USS Tenosa conducted a live-fire exercise against the enemy. Daspit fired torpedo after torpedo. He fired 8, then 10, then 12. He fired 15 torpedoes at the helpless Tonin Maru. Of the 15 fired, 13 hit the target. He watched them strike. He watched the white wakes terminate right against the black steel of the hull. Not a single one detonated. 13 perfect hits. 13 failures. The Tonin Maru, still afloat, was eventually towed away by Japanese destroyers. Daspit had just wasted his entire war patrol. He had wasted thousands of dollars of ordnance. And he had risked the lives of his 80 crewmen for absolutely nothing. He ordered the Tenosa to turn for home. He saved the last remaining torpedo. He didn't fire it. He wanted to bring it back to Pearl Harbor. He wanted to shove it down the throat of the admiral who built it. This was the scandal of the Mark 14 torpedo. For the first 2 years of World War II, the United States Submarine Force, the Silent Service, fought 2 wars. They fought the Imperial Japanese Navy, and they fought their own Bureau of Ordnance. They were sent into battle with a weapon that was more dangerous to them than it was to the enemy. It ran too deep. It exploded too early. And when it actually hit the target, it refused to explode. Japanese captains stood on their bridges and laughed as they watched American torpedoes bounce harmlessly off their hulls. They mocked the Americans. They called them paper tigers. But the American captains stopped listening to the Bureau. They started running their own tests. They started breaking the rules. And when they finally fixed the weapon, the laughter in Tokyo died. Because once the torpedoes started working, the US Submarine Force, less than 2% of the Navy, would burn the Japanese empire to the waterline. This is the story of the greatest bureaucratic failure in military history and the bloody rebellion that fixed it. This is forgotten thunder. To understand the rage of men like Dan Daspit, you have to understand the arrogance of the men who built the weapon. The Mark 14 torpedo was born at the Naval Torpedo Station in Newport, Rhode Island. In the 1930s, this was a secretive, elite facility. The engineers there considered themselves artists. They weren't building ammunition, they were building a machine of unparalleled sophistication. The Mark 14 was expensive. In $1940, a single torpedo cost $10,000. That is roughly $215,000 today. It cost 5 times as much as a luxury car. Because they were so expensive, the Navy refused to test them. When the Bureau of Ordnance, board, tested the Mark 14, they didn't use real warheads. They used dummy heads filled with water or concrete to simulate the weight. They didn't want to blow up a $10,000 machine. They wanted to recover it, polish it, and put it back on the shelf. This penny pinching created a fatal blind spot. The Mark 14 was designed with a secret weapon inside its nose, the Mark 6 exploder. Traditional torpedoes used a contact exploder. It hit the ship, a pin was crushed, and it went boom. Simple. The Mark 6 was different. It was magnetic. The theory was brilliant. A ship's hull is made of steel. As it moves through the Earth's magnetic field, it creates a magnetic anomaly. The engineers at Newport designed a sensor that could detect this change. The plan was for the torpedo to swim under the enemy ship. When it sensed the magnetic field of the keel, it would detonate directly beneath the ship. Water is incompressible. An explosion under the keel creates a massive gas bubble that lifts the ship out of the water and breaks its back. It is the most efficient way to sink a vessel. One torpedo, one battleship. On paper, it was perfect. In the labs at Newport, it worked every time. But the Pacific Ocean isn't a lab. When the war started on December 7, 1941, the US submarine fleet sortied from Pearl Harbor and Manila. They were eager for revenge. They were aggressive. But within weeks, the reports started coming in. And they were horrifying. Captain Tyrell Jacobs, commanding the USS Sargo, fired 8 torpedoes at 2 Japanese transports. He heard the explosions. He saw the water plumes. He signaled target sunk. But when he looked through the periscope, the ships were steaming away at full speed. The torpedoes hadn't hit the ships, they had exploded 50 yards away, prematurely. Other captains reported deep runners. They would line up a perfect shot, fire, and watch the torpedo wake pass directly under the target without detonating. The captains were furious. They returned to base and slammed their fists on the desks of the admirals. "The fish are bad," they screamed. "They run deep. They explode early." The response from the Bureau of Ordnance was one of the most shameful acts in naval history. Admiral Ralph Christie, the head of torpedo operations in Australia, had been one of the designers of the magnetic exploder. He took the complaints personally. He told the captains, "The torpedo is perfect. The problem is you." He blamed the crews. He said they were firing from too far away. He said their sonar data was wrong. He said they were lying about their hits. "If you can't hit with this weapon," Christie told them, "I will find captains who can." It was gaslighting on an industrial scale. The men risking their lives were being told they were incompetent by the men sitting in air-conditioned offices. This is a story of leadership failure that cost thousands of lives. If you believe that the truth should always challenge power, make sure you are subscribed to Forgotten Thunder. We expose the history that the official records try to hide. Join us. ****. The first flaw to be exposed was the depth. In early 1942, the US submarines were being pushed out of the Philippines. They were retreating to Australia. The Japanese were winning everywhere. Admiral Charles Lockwood arrived in Fremantle, Australia, to take command of the submarine force. Lockwood was different. He wasn't a bureaucrat, he was a sailor's admiral. He affectionately called his submariners the boys. He listened to the complaints. He heard the stories of torpedoes passing under ships. Lockwood decided to ignore the Bureau. He ordered an unauthorized test. He took a submarine to a quiet bay in Western Australia called Frenchman's Bay. He bought a massive fishing net, hundreds of feet long. He anchored the net in the water. He ordered the submarine USS Skipjack to fire a live torpedo, with a dummy warhead, through the net. They set the torpedo to run at a depth of 10 feet. The torpedo was fired. It tore through the net. Lockwood sent divers down to check the hole. The hole was at 21 feet. The torpedo was running 11 feet deeper than it was set. Lockwood was stunned. If you fired at a cruiser with a 20-foot draft, and the torpedo ran at 21 feet, you missed. He ran the test again. And again. The result was consistent. The Mark 14 ran deep. But because the engineers at Newport had made a freshman physics mistake. They had tested the torpedoes using dummy warheads filled with water. But the real warhead, filled with Torpex explosive, was heavier than the water-filled dummy. The nose of the combat torpedo was heavier, so it dipped downward. Lockwood sent the data to Washington. "The torpedo runs deep," he cabled. "Fix it." The Bureau of Ordnance wrote back, "Our data shows the torpedo runs true. You set the net wrong." Lockwood exploded. He replied, "I don't care what your data says. My men are dying." He ordered his captains to set their torpedoes to 0 depth, to aim for the surface, just to get a hit. It was a band-aid, but it worked. Suddenly, the Americans started getting hits. But getting hits revealed the second flaw: the magnetic exploder. By late 1942, captains were finally putting torpedoes on target. But now they faced a new problem: premature explosions. The magnetic sensor in the Mark VI exploder was highly sensitive. It was designed to detect the steel hull of a ship. But the engineers in Rhode Island hadn't accounted for the fact that the Earth's magnetic field changes depending on where you are. The magnetic field in Newport, Rhode Island is different from the magnetic field at the equator. As the torpedoes raced through the tropical waters, the magnetic spikes of the ocean waves themselves were tripping the sensors. Torpedoes were exploding 50 yards from the target. This was worse than a dud. A dud stays silent. A premature explosion is a giant "here I am" sign. It alerted the Japanese destroyers. It told them exactly where the submarine was. Japanese destroyers would see the spray, turn down the bearing of the torpedo wake, and drop depth charges on the American subs. The weapon was betraying its user. Admiral Christie, still in charge of the torpedoes in Australia, refused to disable the magnetic exploder. He was obsessed with it. He believed it was the ultimate weapon. He threatened to court-martial any captain who tampered with it. But the captains revolted. They started disabling the magnetic feature in secret. They would have their machinists open the torpedoes and short-circuit the magnetic sensor. They turned them into simple contact torpedoes. When Admiral Nimitz, the commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet, saw the failure rates, he finally stepped in. In June 1943, he ordered the magnetic exploders deactivated fleet-wide. Christie was overruled. The magic weapon was dead. Now, the torpedoes ran straight. And they ran at the right depth. This brings us back to Dan Daspit and the USS Tenosa. July 1943. Daspit had solved the depth problem. He had solved the magnetic problem. He hit the Tonin Maru 15 times. And they bounced off. This was the third and most terrifying flaw: the contact exploder. The Mark 14 had a firing pin at the tip. When it hit the ship, the pin was supposed to slide backward and strike the primer, detonating the warhead. When Daspit brought his golden bullet, the last torpedo, back to Pearl Harbor, Admiral Lockwood decided to do something drastic. He didn't trust the labs. He wanted to see it with his own eyes. He took a crane and hoisted a live warhead 90 feet into the air. Below it, he placed a sheet of armor plate taken from a sunken ship. He dropped the warhead. It fell 90 feet, simulating the speed of a 46-knot impact. It hit the steel plate. Clang! It bounced. It didn't explode. They disassembled the warhead and found the problem. It was a design flaw so stupid it defied belief. The firing pin mechanism was heavy. When the torpedo hit the ship at a perfect 90-degree angle, the deceleration forces were immense, hundreds of gs. The friction on the guide rails of the firing pin was so high that the pin jammed. It couldn't slide back. The harder the torpedo hit, the less likely it was to explode. If you hit the ship at a bad angle, a glancing blow, the friction was lower and it would explode. But if you made a perfect, textbook shot at a 90-degree angle, the torpedo jammed. The Bureau of Ordnance had penalized marksmanship. The laughter of the Japanese captains was justified. They were being hit by sledgehammers that forgot to be bombs. Lockwood was apoplectic. "We have been sending our boys out with dummy logs for 2 years," he said. But now they knew the truth. And the solution was simple. The Pearl Harbor machine shops fabricated a new firing pin. It was lighter. It was made of a different alloy. It took them a week to design and build. Almost overnight, the problem was solved. It took 2 years of blood and frustration to fix what the bureaucrats broke. But once the Silent Service had a working weapon, the war changed instantly. If you respect the persistence of Admiral Lockwood and his boys, verify your subscription. We tell the stories of the men who fixed the unfixable, ***. September 1943. The leash was off. The US submarines sortied with working Mark 14s. The results were apocalyptic for Japan. Japan is an island nation. It has no oil. It has no rubber. It has no iron. It needs to import everything from its empire in Southeast Asia. The US submarines formed a noose around the home islands. They hunted in wolf packs. Groups of 3 or 4 submarines working together. The Japanese merchant fleet began to vanish. In 1942, US subs sank 180 ships. In 1944, they sank 603 ships. Tankers carrying oil from Borneo were torpedoed and burned for days. Troop transports carrying reinforcements to Saipan and Iwo Jima were sent to the bottom, taking entire regiments with them. The Japanese economy collapsed. Factories stopped working because they had no raw materials. The Japanese Navy couldn't sortie its battleships because they had no fuel. The paper tigers had become sharks. One of the greatest victories came from the USS Archerfish. November 1944. Commander Joseph Enright was patrolling off the coast of Japan. He spotted a massive blip on his radar. It looked like an island moving at 20 knots. It was the Shinano. It was the sister ship of the Yamato, converted into an aircraft carrier. It was the largest aircraft carrier ever built at that time. It was on its maiden voyage. Enright stalked it for hours. He maneuvered ahead. He fired 6 Mark 14 torpedoes. 4 of them hit. Boom. 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 There were no duds. There were no deep runners. The warheads detonated deep inside the massive carrier. The Shinano, the pride of the Japanese fleet, capsized and sank 7 hours later. It remains the largest warship ever sunk by a submarine. The Mark 14, the weapon that couldn't sink a whaler in 1943, had just slain a Titan in 1944. But the Mark 14 had one final, tragic twist to play. A 4th flaw that was rare, but fatal. The circular run. October 24, 1944. The Formosa Strait. The USS Tang was the deadliest submarine in the US Navy. Her captain was Richard "Dick" O'Kane. He was the ace of aces. On her 5th patrol, the Tang was a machine of destruction. In a single night, O'Kane attacked a Japanese convoy and sank 5 ships. He was firing torpedoes so fast the crew barely had time to reload. He was down to his last 2 torpedoes. He spotted a crippled transport ship. He lined up for the kill. Fire 23. The torpedo shot out of the tube. It ran straight and true. Fire 24. The last torpedo left the tube. But as O'Kane watched from the bridge, the torpedo did something impossible. It turned. It made a sharp left turn. Then another. It was locked in a rudder jam. It was circling back. All ahead emergency. Right full rudder. O'Kane screamed. It was too late. The Mark 14 torpedo completed a perfect 360-degree circle. It struck the Tang in the stern. The explosion broke the submarine's back. It sank in 180 feet of water. O'Kane and 8 others on the bridge were thrown into the water. Inside the sinking sub, half the crew survived the impact. They huddled in the forward torpedo room. They used Momsen lungs to escape through the escape trunk, one of the only successful deepwater escapes of the war. Only 9 men, including O'Kane, survived the night to be captured by the Japanese. The Tang had been sunk by her own weapon. It was a tragic end to the greatest career in submarine history. By August 1945, the job was done. The US Submarine Force had virtually wiped the Japanese merchant marine from the face of the earth. The numbers are staggering. US submarines comprised only 1.6% of the US Navy. Yet, they accounted for 55% of all Japanese tonnage sunk. They sank 1,178 merchant ships. They sank 214 warships, including 8 aircraft carriers and 1 battleship. They strangled the empire. When the B-29s arrived to burn the cities were already dark because there was no coal for the power plants. But the cost was high. 52 American submarines were lost. 3,500 submariners are still on eternal patrol. It was the highest casualty rate of any branch of the U.S. military, 22%. The Mark 14 torpedo is a case study in the danger of arrogance. The bureaucrats at Newport prioritized saving money over saving lives. They prioritized their own egos over the feedback of the men in the arena. They laughed at the captains. They blamed the victims. But the captains had the last laugh. When the war ended, Admiral Lockwood ordered a statue built at the submarine base in Pearl Harbor. It lists the names of the 52 lost boats. It does not list the names of the bureaucrats who designed the Mark 6 exploder. The Japanese captains who mocked the dud torpedoes in 1942 learned a hard lesson. You can only count on American incompetence for so long. Once the problem is fixed, the response is overwhelming. The silent service didn't brag. They didn't hold press conferences. They just fixed their torpedoes, went back to sea, and cleared the ocean. This has been the story of the Mark 14 scandal. If you believe these stories of resilience and rebellion need to be told, please like this video and subscribe. Leave a comment below with "Silent Service" to honor the 52 boats on eternal patrol. We will see you in the next briefing, ****. This is Forgotten Thunder. The weapons they laughed at. The stories they forgot.